APUS History Review, Lesson 32, The New Deal. As we'd seen in our previous lesson, the Great Depression strained American values, Americans' belief in themselves and their nation and their way of life more than any other crisis except perhaps the Civil War up to this time. There was real questioning as to whether or not the democratic experiment could work. And with Franklin Roosevelt's landslide election in 1932, the question becomes, what will this new man do? What is this New Deal of which he was speaking in campaigns? And the contrast between Roosevelt and Hoover involved studies of the person. And often in history, there's sort of a debate that goes on among historians about, does the man make the times or do the times make the man? And in this instance, you see a combination of both. Herbert Hoover, his entire life, had been successful at everything he'd done. He had never known failure until at the point in life when he confronted failure was at the highest office of the land. He'd had no training in dealing with it. Franklin Roosevelt, an individual who grew up in a patrician family, very well-to-do, came from Old Bunny, a solid background in upstate New York in terms of wealth and patrician values, was struck down by polio at a young age. He'd been sort of a lightweight, sort of a playboy up until this time, sort of a dabbler in politics, but struck down by polio in 1921 and would never walk again. And what that wound up doing for him, though, is he had to battle the disease and had to battle to essentially get himself back in a position to be a productive member of society. What this did is he didn't allow the disease to stop him. And his struggle against it gave him character, it gave him patience, it gave him depth of will, it gave him strength of character, it gave him certain traits that Hoover, as an unbending ideologue, as a true believer, never had to confront until too late in life to change. Whereas Roosevelt was in a position where he had encountered these challenges early enough in his life as a younger man that he grew up with them, and in many ways it changed his outlook on the world and on life and made him a more serious person, made him a person who had compassion and could understand for others and put himself in their position. When Roosevelt comes to office, Roosevelt promises a pretty non-specific set of plans other than the fact that he's just going to try things. He'll try to do things. And that is largely what the New Deal is going to be in many ways. He's going to bring with him to Washington the so-called brain trust. He's going to ask for the advice of academics, ask for the advice of social and political thinkers of the day, many of whom were people that had come out of the trenches of the progressive movement as younger people in that earlier part of the cycle. We've talked about pendulums swinging back and forth. We're now going to see a counter swing away from laissez-faire, free market economics, back towards government reform and regulation, similar to the progressive era in many ways. In fact, an idea I can't stress enough for you to be aware of, many New Deal ideas have been around for a long time. They simply are now coming back into a position where they can be enacted on. They had been progressive era ideas, if not earlier. But so, Roosevelt's key ideas on the economy comes from, in many ways, in the biggest, broadest sense, the ideas of an economist named John Maynard Keynes. Keynes is an economist whose theories, I think you've read about them in your history books, you should have known them. His theories are the basis for most non-communist governments today. And the theory basically runs like this. During times of economic contraction, it's the job of the government in many ways to try to stimulate economic activity. If you're going to think of it as being like if it's like a social event or a party, it would be the job of the government to bring the punch bowl to the party. Now, once the party gets going, once the economy starts moving and begins energizing and running itself and sustaining itself, once the party starts to get social and festive, once you get prosperity, then it's the job of the government to take that punch bowl away. Not to lead to depression, but to make sure the economy doesn't overheat and over-accelerate. So it's always kind of like trying to balance where that punch bowl ought to be on the head of a pin. When do we bring it in? When do we stimulate the economy more? When do we take it off? And this references then the idea of pump priming. Nobody primes pumps anymore, so that's an example that doesn't really work for your generation. It would be more, perhaps for your generation, it would be better to say jump starting. Like jump starting a car. To jump start the economy, the government ought to spend money. They ought to deficit spend, borrowing against the future, spending money during bad economic times in order to then spend less during good times when the private sector can sustain itself. This is Keynesian economics. It's a major AP history term, and it's the opposite in many ways of the supply side model, the trickle-down model we'd seen in the 1920s prior to this. The New Deal could be said to revolve around three very general philosophical tenets, the famous 3 R's in the New Deal. Those three R's being relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, cut off stop the bleeding, stop the worst damages to the economy and the suffering that people have. Recovery, find ways to put people in positions to sustain themselves again, and institutionally try to maybe put them in a position to change the economy somewhat. And then reform, put in new safeguards and rules and regulations to make sure something like this never ever happens again. Those were the 3 R's in which he was working on. And I guess you could call those 3 R's something like a shotgun approach. Now, what I mean by a shotgun approach are almost like throwing dirt clods at a wall, I guess, if you could. Shotgun approach, I pull the trigger, buckshot goes everywhere. The New Deal was not any master, organized, coherent philosophy. In this regard, it's an awful lot like what the Progressive Era was in earlier chapters. Roosevelt is going to see the New Deal as being a challenge to try to see the Depression, rather, as a challenge he's going to throw things at. And so there's many New Deal programs that are sort of half-baked, disorganized, even contradictory, working at cross purposes to one another as he tries new things. Imagine, if you will, that this chalkboard, the whiteboard, is the Depression. Roosevelt's trying to knock it down. And so he's going to throw a series of programs at it. He's going to throw things such as Social Security at it, the Works Projects Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He's going to throw all of these problems at the Great Depression. A lot of them will not be effective, and they'll kind of bounce off, or they'll slide to the side. A few of these programs, their legacies are still with us today, they'll stick. And those are the programs that are going to stick to make institutional long-term changes. Roosevelt is going to transform the relationship of the people to their government and of the government to its people in a way that no president has done or would have done since perhaps Lincoln, and arguably that no president has done ever since. So the nation was desperate by the time he's inaugurated. They're close to panic. And Democrats have won large majorities in Congress, so as well as the presidency, so Roosevelt can get laws passed if he wants them to be passed. And as such, in his first 100 days, which is a term you hear every president judged by now, in his first 100 days, Roosevelt asks for and receives an enormous amount, a flurry of legislation to be passed to actively start dealing with the economy. And the first thing he's dealing with is largely the R's of relief and recovery. Initially, there's the bank holiday, and many of these I won't be going over with you at length because your history textbook will provide them for you, but it's a big list of vital, important terms you need to know. We'll give you a travelogue kind of view of them, but in many ways it's up to you for some of the details. You've talked about them before. There's no way you got through your history class and didn't talk the New Deal. It's simply too important. Bank holiday, Roosevelt closes the banks of the nation for 3 days and has them reorganize their finances. The government comes in and helps them to reorganize. The sound banks then reopen. It's a first step towards restoring faith and trust in the economy. Repeals prohibition, which he argued had 2 effects. First of all, it would decrease the lawlessness, and second of all, it was a jobs bill, as he saw it. It would put people back to work in the legitimate brewing of alcohol and alcoholic beverages and in the sale and purchase and consumption of these beverages. But the bulk of what the New Deal's first 100 days of legislation is about is the so-called alphabet soup agencies. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is designed to try to set farm prices and limit demand, limit production to the level that demand needed it at. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which is going to put unemployed Americans to work on preservation, unemployed young Americans to work on preservation and conservation projects across the United States. Each year, each paycheck that CCC workers got, they were required to send some of it back home to their parents and their families, so that way the money kind of trickled throughout the economy. Instead of trickle-down economics, this is more trickle-up economics, if you will, spreading that money from these jobs programs. National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NRA, was designed for the government to set up codes of production and wages and prices for every industry. Now, mind you, you should know this. It's a multiple choice thing that shows up, and if you write on the New Deal, you have to talk about it. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the National Recovery Act were both declared unconstitutional by the court. They were thrown out as overreaches of federal authority. That's going to have some significance for later on in our lecture, but it's important for you to consider. The FDIC and HOLC, Hulk, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If you deposit money in a bank that's FDIC insured, if that bank collapses or fails, your deposits are guaranteed, at least today, up to, I believe, $250,000. So it's designed to make sure that people could not play by the rules, be fair, and have their life savings be wiped out because their bank speculated in the private market. Homeowners Loan Corporation gave people loans in order to help improve their homes, or loan money for mortgage bill holders faced with the loss of their property, kind of putting a stay on that, on their being evicted and foreclosed. Foreclosed properties don't help a community. They don't help the people getting thrown out, but they also don't help the community get back on its feet. So it's designed to kind of stabilize that. Federal Emergency Relief Administration, get people direct aid and relief through that first tough winter of 1933. Public Works Administration, large programs to build schools, bridges, dams, airports, major projects. There's New Deal projects all around your society, all around your town or community you live in today. You just don't know what you're looking at when you see them. There's a whole host of projects that were built between the 1930s and the beginning of the 1940s that would have been projects where federal government paid local workers to put them to work building things for the government to also better communities. Tennessee Valley Authority will be the biggest example of regional planning, a system designed to reduce both soil and erosion control, but also stabilize the Tennessee rivers and generate hydroelectric power in this region and make it a productive region in the hill country of Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama. Touches about 5 or 6 states. 1934, beyond the first 100 days, the Securities Exchange Commission regulate the trading and sale of stocks on the market so that you can't have stock prices artificially inflated, that you can't be telling untruths about the stock being sold, that insider trading doesn't take place where people who know more information than others can make more money as a result of what they know. And the Federal Homeowners Association, FHA, was also designed to help people in terms of getting the Federal Housing Administration, rather. It was designed to provide small loans to homeowners who wanted to remodel their homes or construct new ones, getting Americans into this ownership society model where they could keep these homes and help stabilize their communities. The abandonment of the gold standard also takes place during this time. Roosevelt deliberately uncouples the United States from the gold standard, arguing that the contractionary nature of having just the United States on the gold standard inhibits the ability of the federal government to prime the pump, to jumpstart the economy by flooding new money and new programs into that economy. So if the first New Deal is in many ways going to deal with recovery, or relief, if you will, second New Deal is also going to be relief and reform. First New Deal is going to be the other way around. So the WPA, Works Projects Administration, putting Americans to work on projects that would have been building schools, cultural centers, libraries, employing musicians, painters, artists, authors, writers, as well as regular unskilled and skilled labor. Rural electrification was going to be involved, trying to regionally get electricity into the countryside where Americans had still lived in a pre-20th century sort of kerosene lamp world. And the large one here, the National Labor Relations Act, which is also known as the Wagner Act, legitimized collective bargaining and union labor. This is going to be the beginning, as we'll see soon enough, of a significant transformation in American labor relations and leads to the introduction of American labor as being a fundamental, ordinary, mainstream part of the American economic body politic. Social Security, the first old age defined benefit program for Americans. Historically, local people, local communities and charities had to take care of their own, the very poor, the very old, the very young, the indigent. And in many cases, the poor were thought to deserve no more than that. But we see this change now to this first program for old age in the United States, 65 and above. So all sorts of regulation and centralized planning is taking place with this first part of the New Deal. In our second component of the New Deal, our second part of this lesson, we're going to see how this New Deal runs into some controversy along these lines and also some conflicts as it tries to meet these goals of solving the Depression and giving Americans hope and opportunity.